Our Artex Talk series offers a dynamic platform for thought-provoking discussions, featuring some of Africa's most innovative voices in contemporary art and culture. This year's panels spotlights the expertise of our participating artists and guest curators, each bringing their unique perspective and vision. We'll be joined first by Curator at Large, Mr. Lipsicle, and Ed Keazor for Mark Makers, Forging Better Futures. Please welcome Mr. Lipsicle and Ed Keazor.
Just while we set up, I hope the AV teams can play us some music.
Our society is underdevelopment because of an alien system on our people. So there's no music for enjoyment, there's nothing like love, there's something like a struggle for people's existence. So as an artist, politically, artistically, the whole idea about your environment must be represented in the music and the arts. So the art is what is happening at a particular time of a people's development or underdevelopment. So I think as far as Africa is concerned, music cannot be for enjoyment. Music has to be for revolution. Really working with the people and liking the people and doing your duty as a citizen. Play music and art. If you feel bad about it, do something about it.
Thank you. Ed, I wanted to set the stage with that song. It's something that you also mentioned in your talk, the TED Talk that you did 10 years ago. That was a lead up to this project. If you feel bad about it, do something about it. Yeah, that song has been like a mantra for me. It has encouraged me. It has anchored my. So I just thought that today would be a great way of starting our conversation.
Thank you.
So if you don't know, I'm an Eritrean independent curator that's based in Vancouver, and this is my 4th year being here and welcomed in Lagos with the Artex family. So please help me and welcome Ed Keazor, who is my counterpart, my thinking partner, and a very generous individual, a serious historian and archivist that's part of your community here. So please give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So Ed, I'm just going to give you a short biography. Ed Keazor is a renowned lawyer, archivist, historian, and filmmaker. He has authored critically acclaimed works such as the Lagos-Hamburg Line, A Brief History of German Commerce in Nigeria, Great Nigerians We Never Knew About, which is also the inspiration for the Mark Makers Project, Unsung Pioneers, and the Federation Cup and Nigeria Football. So Ed is a subject matter specialist on Nigerian colonial history from 1000 AD to the 1980s, and he really is. He can rattle off so many statistics. Every time I sit together with him, it's such a pleasure because I feel like I'm sitting underneath a very big tree and learning. So thank you, Ed. His fields include politics, sociality, and economics, as well as music histories. So this afternoon, every once in a while, I'm going to ask our wonderful AV team in the back to move to the next slide for me. So on that note, all of the great visuals that you're going to see this afternoon are sourced from Ed and his work as an archivist. Ed, I'd like to take you back to the beginning of your journey as a 7-year-old in your home where TV only started at 5 p.m. What did you do with your free time?
Wow. Okay. Well, you would assume that a strapping, proto-macho young man would want to be going out playing football and boxing and climbing trees. Actually, to be honest, it was not as exciting as that. I just read books, I was a bit of a geek. So, and my father had an incredible collection of historical books, particularly World War II, he was something of a subject matter expert on World War II, and indeed World War I. And so from the age of 6 even, I'd start with images, and when I could read, and I started gathering words, so that became like a bit of an obsession. And as books came into the house, that's what we did till 5 o'clock when NBC TV would start up with programs at the time. So yes, that's why. So I really had no choice in the matter, because a bit of a restless child. But books were how I exercised my restlessness rather than going out and fighting dragons. Let's put it that way.
Would you say that maybe your father was a role model for you?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, without any question. Because the beauty of it is that he was very happy to see me reading, and not just reading, but reading with a lot of passion and intention. And I would bombard his life with questions, and he never tired of answering them. And in fact, he would engage in conversations with me almost as if we were peers. So that gave me a great deal of agency in the narrative. I felt, okay, I'm among. And in fact, I actually developed a very, very bad habit of when he would be in conversation with his mates, his friends, on subjects of history, this snotty-faced kid will be there like, oh, by the way, and so and so. And then I'll get some very nasty, they're like, come, who is this? But the thing is, nobody could say I was wrong. So, yes, he definitely was my role model. And even till date, he's, suffering age is caught up with him, and he's about 90 years old and quite frail. But I come back to Nigeria constantly so I can sit down with him and still continue to tap. He still continues to amaze me with the breadth of his memory. He can't remember what happened 10 minutes ago, but he can tell you what happened in 1937 at Abeokuta, where he grew up. And that for me is such a blessing, and yeah, definitely my role model, and I don't want to get emotional.
When I was thinking about this project, I was really thinking about the wholeness that I had in my home. My first role models were my family members, and I think the moment that I went out into the world, and there was like that friction, let's say, of how I was seen outside of my home versus what was happening inside of my home, was the first time where I really started to think, well, who am I and how does the world see me? Which I think relates to our conversation, and that
Absolutely.
will become more apparent as we move forward. As we were talking about the development of this project, which was really, it was conceived, or this idea of the Promised Lands was really conceived by us thinking after last year, where we were talking about the dialogue, what would be an important contribution to the context here, was this idea of thinking, well, who should we be working on behalf of? And we were thinking about the statistic that says that come 2050, more than a third of the world's working population are going to be in Africa. And if we think about Nigeria, that means that Nigeria has an important role to play in that. And we were thinking about who comes to the fair, like all of these young, fantastic individuals that are sitting on the front row on the left side of me, as well as their elders, who would be individuals that are in high school and in university. And what we realized is that these individuals are going to be the parents and also the business leaders come 2050. So in fact, the work that we're doing right now is for you. And I think, Ed, you also talk about that.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So, Ed, I think we've gone a bit too far. Can we please go back on the slides? You can go back to the one that's the cartoon, please. Yes, we can land there. That's a good spot to land. Ed, when we were talking about this idea of talking about unsung Nigerian trailblazers and pioneers, you mentioned this idea of a sense of self and why it was important to be looking at individuals who've made contributions such as these. Can you help us and set the context for us to understand what was happening in Nigeria in the 70s that produced a different way of being in the world here?
Thank you. The reality is that Nigeria, at independence, there was a lot of optimism about our prospects in the future. We were seen as the giant in the sun. It's actually a phrase used by a US newspaper, the giant in the sun, when the Prime Minister went to the States to, on a state visit, was received by President Kennedy. It was, there was this fanfare and excitement about the country. And then 6 to 7 years later, we were in a civil war. But then just before everything would crash, suddenly oil, the Middle East crisis sparked out in 1967. And then slowly the price of oil went up, and as we had oil, it changed our fortunes. So it papered the cracks for a while. In the 70s, there was an energy, there was a friend of mine who is an oil and gas writer, and I just premier oil and gas writer, Tony Keazor, actually used an analogy from an Afrobeat song by Davido. It's like Omo Babolo, the son of a rich man, because there was a sense of affluence, in the country. There was a high consumerism, excess, to be honest, that permeated the early to mid 70s. But then from late 70s, reality bit. Obviously, once oil prices come down, you've got a monocultural economy. Clearly, it suffered. And thus, by the 1980s, in 1984, suddenly we had imported everything from Stella Artois beer to excess cement that we didn't need. And then by 1983, we now had what they called Esenco, essential commodities. Literally, we were sharing sugar. They were rationing sugar, rationing powdered milk to civil servants. That was a bit of a twist. And then suddenly the middle class had been the bedrock of the economy, and that optimism was slowly being compressed and stamped out. That by the late 80s, with the certain economic liberal policies, which were probably a little bit ill thought out, the middle class pretty much were crushed. And then you had these proud people who, that by 1974, when the Nigerians landed Oxford Street, you knew they were there because they were buying up everything. But that by the late 1980s, we were no longer buying, we were definitely still on Oxford Street, but walking in the stores, walking in the basements, carrying boxes. Meanwhile, when you ask the man, when he's upset, he tells you, "Oh, do you know I was a managing director in Nigeria? I don't need to do this." Well, actually, you do. And that's how the middle class was. So how we began to look at how we saw ourselves, Omo Babolo, son of a rich man in the 70s, suddenly changed. And the reality of our economic difficulties were pushed into our faces. And then that self-doubt that creeps in when things are difficult entered the psyche almost as an overarching motif. That sense of self was diminished. Now, you may say that the sense of self that we had in the early 70s was probably an illusion, inflated. But then that lowered self-esteem that we had in the 1980s, late 1980s, was not an illusion. It was a real reality. We were in trouble, financially and economically. And it permeated, because not just about the economic, but the impact of that was that in many other aspects, who you thought you were. That conflict between who you see in the mirror and how people actually see you. For once, it came together, because what we're seeing in the mirror was the way people outside were seeing us. They're like, you poor things. So upon all your noise, this is where you came to. And then, on a much wider scale, I moved abroad in the late 90s, and my study of history started then, even though I was running a law practice. And I overheard a conversation on a radio program about sub-Saharan Africa not contributing anything to global history or global development. And there was an Afro-Caribbean academic on the other side, while you had a right-wing academic on the other side. And I was most underwhelmed by my brothers, that's the Afro-Caribbean historians' responses. I was like, you need to be dealing with this. Don't waffle, don't get emotive. Drop examples of why he's wrong. And I wasn't getting that. I was getting emotive ad hominem. I was like, okay, no, maybe I should do my own job here. Let me get involved. And I started researching. I said, look, you know what? What we need is for every young African or every young black person to have in his pocket, like a pack of cards, responses to such, abuse.
Yeah.
Because it was obviously false. But the thing is, if you don't know the facts, if you can't respond with data, not abuse, just data, then, how do I do something about it? So that segues into the talk about Fela's maxim, which actually he borrowed from the civil rights movement in America.
Yes.
If you feel bad about it,
do something
about it. I said, well, let me do my own part. And I set up a blog. Look, man, there were people doing stuff out there, but I can only talk about my own personal story. And that was where my quest to create something that would remind our people, and it wasn't so much, I'm not really interested in convincing a racist writer that we had something to say, to respond to it. I'm more interested in convincing young people from my own ilk that this is who you are, this is your heritage, and this is your springboard to raising up your continent beyond being told, oh, you guys can't do much on your own. Oh, Africa is condemned to just muck things up. You want to know that you had a heritage of getting things right. And let that be, because conditioning the mind of young people is absolutely important in the process of national development, beyond just the esoterics or just whipping them into shape or just the economics of need. But just that, I mean, there's a certain something about America at one stage. America felt there was nothing it could not achieve. And look, for a time it helped. Obviously, sometimes other events intervene. So it was important that we did this. And that formed the motivation for my scholarship in broad senses, and it formed a particular motivation for this book, 120 Great Nigerians We Never Knew, because I wanted to go beyond just the, oh, we're used to this, but more about what people you didn't know, the ordinary people who probably didn't have millions of pounds in their bank accounts, who were just doing extraordinary things on a micro level, but massive impact, and that's where it came about.
So Ed, I think I'm going to get you even more fiery than that. I'm going to take you back a little bit further back. And can we go to the next slide? Can you help us identify who the gentleman is in that image?
Oh yes, Sir later Lord Frederick John Diltree Lugard and Northern Emirs. Quite a few of them. I can see the Emir of Kano, and I can't see the Emir of Katsina. But yeah, 1934, shortly before he died.
And can we go to the next slide? And Ed, I would like you to read off what this gentleman had to say about us. So please help us out. Okay, there we go.
Yes. In character and temperament, the typical African of this race type is a happy, thriftless, excitable person, lacking in self-control, discipline, and foresight. He lacks the power of organization and is conspicuously deficient in the management and control alike of men or business. He loves the display of power, but fails to realize its responsibility.
So, this thing of who you say you are versus who others say you are is continuously contested, right?
Yes.
But that's where education is really important, to be seeding in people's minds that they come from complex histories, not just simply the poor ones, right?
Absolutely.
So can we go to the next slide? I mean, this slide is just supposed to give us a sense of imagination, to really think about the power of imagination. And forgive me, I'm just going to read a quote to you from one of the individuals that we have featured in the project, in Mark Makers. And this is coming from an individual who is a car designer. He designed the lead product for Chevrolet, which is a large, coming from an American automotive company. He developed the first e-vehicle product for this company that became their signature product. So Jelani says, this is what he said in 2014, "We must never underestimate the amazing power of human imagination. The ability to envision a dramatically positive and dynamic future. Every great city, every monument, every historic feat as it stands for all the world to see was once pure thought, pure imagination, acted upon and brought into reality." So with that note, before there was the individuals like the fellow that were willing to go to jail for ideas, their ideas and their values. Can you take us back to pre-independence Nigeria, to this incredible individual, Habib, Raji Habib?
Raji Abdallah, yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah. I think it's probably the next slide.
Yes.
I was inspired. I got to know the story of Habib Raji Abdallah through an older colleague, Chief Ajibade Fashion Thomas, who's great journalist, legendary journalist. And he wrote an article many years ago called The Fire Eaters, of which he was prime. And that inspired me to read more about this man. It was incredible. First of all, he was from the north of Nigeria. And, he was a journalist, he's actually a broadcaster. An exceptionally articulate man, often dashing some of the silly stereotypes about Northerners in the 1930s and 1940s. An exceptionally bright man, and also a fiery nationalist, and he he combined his articulation with, fiery, angry nationalism that was subsequently seen, probably in some form or the other, from the black Pan-Africanists, the black nationalists in America, 20, 30 years later. Now, the story is that they decided they'd had enough. He joined the group called the Zikists, which was a group of angry nationalist young men who felt, look, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe was their hero because he was another very charismatic, orator who fired people off to fight against colonialism and imperialism. So they were like, look, Zik, you know what? You can be nice and gentle, but we're going to stoke the fires on your behalf. Stay out of this. We'll do what we have to do. But you inspired us to do this. So himself and another chap called Mokugo Okoye and Oged Macaulay, the son of Herbert Macaulay, they had various meetings and town hall talks where they excoriated the colonial authorities. They said things that really many people were afraid to say. And there's a meeting in Lagos in which they delivered some fiery speeches and where they basically said, look, enough. We're not even talking about, okay, Brits, when are you leaving? We want you to leave now. Go. We've had enough. As far as we're concerned, this land should be governed by people like us. There should be no more excuses. There should be no more dilly-dallying on the question of our freedom. We want you to leave now. Because let's not forget that this was around the time, 1947, India had gained its independence. And that really inspired a lot of the nationalist movements. 2 years after the World War II, when veterans had come back from the war, and they told stories about how we'd been told we were inferior to the white man, but then we were out there fighting side by side in Burma, in East Africa, and they were dying and bleeding as we were. We saw our white officers crying sometimes with pain and suffering while we were soldiering on and probably carrying them on our backs. So how come we were supposed to be inferior? So they came back with a sense of self, a sense of self-possession, and it segued into the nationalist movement at the time, because let's not forget, in 1945, the first general strike had happened, which pretty much brought the colonial government to its knees. And eventually, obviously, it lasted for 2 months. It was the biggest and most demonstrative pushback since the amalgamation and since the conquest of Nigeria. So these guys were riding on that nationalist wave, and his speech was fiery. Now, obviously, he had a problem because he was a civil servant. So when you're condemning the government you work for, sedition, the offense of sedition kicks in. And apart from that, obviously, some of the things they said were almost treasonable. So they were tried, they were arraigned on criminal charges, and you would expect that maybe after thinking about it, he might get slightly cagey. No, his speech first of all, he refused to submit himself to the court. They were like, look, if you want to satisfy those that put you here, I plead, I ask, I beg you to impose the maximum sentence. I want the maximum sentence that you can offer, but it will not change the fact that one day you will leave this land. So when people talk about Nigerians not suffering for our independence, I use this as a citation that, look, there were those who were ready to die for this. He was ready to die. They went to prison, they came out, and even his first week in prison, he actually wrote an article which was published, where he said, do not despair, do not be weary, do not worry about us, we're fine. We're actually having a good time here in more words than one. And that was truly inspirational stuff. And for me, it was because the nature of our psyche, particularly since the 90s, was that everyone in the political space could be compromised. And do not for one second think that there was no attempt to compromise these men. There were. But they were unwavering. And as far as I'm concerned, it showed the best of us. Men of integrity, women also of integrity, because the market women of Lagos were their supporters. Well, just that they couldn't charge them for sedition because, well, they were entrepreneurs, but they were people of integrity, people of unshakable integrity and unshakable courage. And these were templates that I felt, okay, young people who had gotten used to that phrase, leave that thing. Leave that thing is one of the most dangerous phrases that could be repeated in the history of our country, because leave that thing was rife during the Babangida era when anyone could be compromised. And then you'd be told, cool, calm down, stop all this fiery nationalist noise, calm down, let's see what we can get. And then, change and come and act mature. Maybe we should adopt a more mature approach to this nationalism. No, there was no compromise with these guys. And what it showed was a template of true courage, which was repeated by other icons like Gani Fawehinmi, one of my mentors, Chief Aloha Kabashonro. Fela was also of that ilk,
yes,
with all his flaws. So my point being, these were templates for young people to see and feel that we could be better than the compromise models that had been strewn around as the acceptable, mature norm in the 90s.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went on.
As you can see, you're always learning when you're with Ed. Ed, can we move on and talk about a different form of activism and your focus on women? Can we move to the next slide? We did this last year in the graphic stories where we were looking at cartooning. We were looking at how women were represented in cartoons, and we realized that there were no cartoonists until the 90s, no women cartoonists. So women were always being depicted by men. So this has always been something, well, let's say that in your work as a historian, you're always looking at the representation, who's being marginalized, and how do we remediate that. So that's how we enter into this, the category that we call the first of their time. In fact, almost everybody that's listed in Mark Makers is a pioneer and a trailblazer in one way or another. But Ed, can you just tell us in simple terms, what's the big deal about having a woman fronting a band?
Okay, I'm sorry, can I stand?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. You see, I want you to look at this photograph. This was in 1965. Victoria Remy was rare, in almost an aberration, because women were not supposed to be going to a nightclub without men. Women were not supposed to be playing band. No. Which is why her band was called the Decencies. I am a decent lady. You understand? Now, she was bold, in your face, and actually an excellent guitarist. And as you can imagine, for lots of us who are in the space where we have to be twice as good as certain others to be accepted as minorities, she had to be 3 times as good as a male guitarist. She was actually a virtuoso. Now, she played with Bobby Benson's, I beg your pardon, she played with Victor Laya. She played with several other high life bands. And eventually, she got her own stage at the Roadhouse Hotel. And she was really something of, she got quite a few jeers and whatever, but the jeers soon died down once she started playing. Once she started handling that guitar. Look, if you had any prejudices, you shut your mouth and you listened. So Victoria was so important. And the question that they put to her was like, don't you think of marriage? She says, I'm married to my guitar now. My guitar is my husband, And then you want to look at the way she's dressed. I don't want to make any allusions, but all I know is I am a feminist. And this is not just talk. I'm a feminist. And this really represented, look, I'm not waiting for your validity, your validation. I will prove myself. And she did. And don't get the impression that this was easy. There was nothing easy about rising up to pretty much was at least the mid-range of prominence in the musical scene at the time. There was nothing easy about it. And she represented, what about smashing glass ceilings and gaining respect. Because I'm a part-time musician and I run a band. Anybody who is in the musical space can tell you that to handle musicians is not easy. They are creatives are a difficult bunch. And then when you've got sexist, arrogant bullies, which human beings are that way, and then having to be commanded by a woman, it tells you how formidable she was. Then we now go to Oladuni Decency, whose story was slightly different in the sense that she came after Victoria Iremi and a couple of others, and after Rosalind Golly and so on and so forth. But she was the first to lead a juju band. And she was first of all, she could play that guitar, and she was an incredible singer. And she was not in any way, her femininity was, was certainly, she held it out, but at the same time, she held her own. And she was vocal. Give more women a chance. And the interesting thing, her husband was her biggest supporter. It wasn't just about, and you hardly heard Rasaki's voice, Rasaki Oduguwa. You hardly saw him. He just stayed behind her as a sideman and let his wife take the stage. And I thought that was a really powerful message. That's one of the reasons why she's here. She sadly died early. And in Victoria's case, I can only assume that because no one has seen her since the end of the Civil War. No one. And I'm talking about searching for like 10 years. We've not been able to find her. But she passed away in late 1978 or early 79. And we were robbed of what would have been a direct legacy of band leadership, which obviously nowadays we have lots of female band, I think I'll sit down now, lots of female band leaders. But the beauty of this was that these were two women at a time, at a cusp in our history when it was not supposed to be normal. It was not supposed to be accepted for them to be leading. And not just leading, but leading well. And it wasn't tokenism. It wasn't about, oh, well, let's just give women, let them tick boxes. These were, pardon my French, they were very good guitarists. Thank you.
Through the process of the research together with you, I remember reading one of the quotes that Oladuni wrote in an interview in 1978 for a magazine called New Breed. She wrote, "I'm tired of being the only one. I want more women to join me." So, with more focus on women, can we talk about the first poetess who was also an educationist?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about Nana Asmau?
Yes. Nana Asmau was the daughter of Usman Danfodio. And now, as I found out, because as I said, sometimes we're clouded by stereotypes. Auntie, you're welcome, ma. You're clouded by stereotypes, and we think of obviously the Muslim faith as crowding women into the back door and not allowing them a voice and all that business, and which probably there's some credence in some regard to it. But I was genuinely surprised to learn of not just the daughter of one of the most famous, Muslim evangelists in Nigerian history, but then herself had a massive amount of agency in her work, in her own evangelism. And to find that a lot of that work involved inspiring women. She had a very strong focus on the education of women. And obviously this was within the confines and the strictures of the Islamic faith. Obviously the teachers had to be women to go into the areas of Perda where the women were kept. But she encouraged, because as far as she was concerned, the Quranic principles, the Quran itself actually encouraged knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge as one of the tenets of the faith, and that women should not be excluded from that. And she worked actively whilst, it must be said that she had the privilege of being the daughter of the Caliph himself, Usman Danfodio, which gave her a certain level of power, which maybe somebody else might not have had. But then it's how you use your power that matters. And she used it positively. And so she actually recruited a cadre of teachers called the Jajis, who would go in and teach, and she was also a poetess, or poet, I shouldn't use that phrase, poet, it's very politically inclusive. She's actually a poet herself, and wrote some powerful poetry. There's an anthology called Wakar Gewaye, and it was written in Ajami script. If anyone's around the British Library, they actually have their Endangered Archives project has quite a vast number of her poetry. And really beautifully crafted works. And, and we're talking about the 18th century, the 18th to the early 19th century. So she was an extremely important figure for me, and it was such a pleasure to find out a lot more about this, because I would say I did not know, this is a world that I was not acquainted with. To see that the Muslim world at this time, even within our own sphere, had this focus, against, admittedly, the patriarchal forces which railed, because I would not believe that she did not meet opposition to this. Of course she did, but the fact that she plowed on with this made her an extremely important figure and an inspirational figure, hence her inclusion in the book.
Yes, and Ed, you were talking about that being in the 18th century, but access to education for young women is still an issue. I was just thinking about Muhammad Ba'aba, who created the Pot and Pot. The idea of preserving fresh food, and how in the context in northern Nigeria, for example, that young girls will have to also sell the food from their family, because it has to essentially be sold within the same day. And when they have to do that, they don't actually get to go to school. So it's just, advocating for education for all sectors of the society is something that's really important, and something that we have to fight for even today. And if you're interested to see Nana's book, it's actually in the library, in the left-hand side. So let's talk about, excuse me, another champion of the people, Chinyere Asika, who has connections to the Black Panthers, ANC, as well as a movement that mobilized 1 million women in Nigeria. So Ed, can you just share a little bit about Chinyere for us?
Yes, I will first of all declare an interest because Auntie Chinyere Adibweze, as we call her traditional title, has been known to me all of my life. I was, my brother Obiasika, her son, who's over there, invited me 13 years ago to write a biography of his father. And then in the course of that, I was left open-mouthed when I heard her story, an incredible story. And I'm sorry, I'm going to stand again. I was interviewing her about her husband, but I was like, I want to hear your story. And she talked about how she went to America in 1962. She was on an ASPAL fellowship, was literally a brilliant woman. She went to Queen's College, Lagos, by the way, which obviously has the best, such as my wife and my wife's sister over there. The very, very best brains go to Queen's College. And she she was admitted to Mills College in California. And she didn't she obviously was an exceptional student. Her father was the great Nathan Ejogo, one of the foremost, educationists in Eastern Nigeria in the early 20th century. So there was that pedigree. But she was also a very independent-minded, fiery woman. I used to describe her as a force of nature. She didn't just go there and excel academically. Come on, that was standard. She was also a member of a rock band. She was actually a drummer in a rock band, a beat band, should I say, as it were, in the early 60s. And then she got involved with the Black Panthers, the Black Panther movement. And she actually appeared on an ABC, or NBC program alongside Stokely Carmichael. Now, there's a book on Stokely Carmichael in the library. You want to read about him. He's a very interesting character. Kwame Ture, as he became later on. And apart from being also a champion swimmer, at the time. Now, she brought these credentials back. She met her husband and they came back together. But then what's the beauty of this relationship was her constant agency. She loved her husband, but her husband knew, look, I have one of the strongest, most independent-minded women, and he had no compunctions because he had no insecurities. As far as he was concerned, well, I need to be worthy of this woman. And that was pretty much their journey. Now, the Nigerian Civil War happened, and for a lot of historians who know, Okpabia Seka became the administrator of the liberated areas of eastern Nigeria, the East Central State that it became. A lot of Biafrans were not happy about that because he was Igbo and he was work on the federal side. And one of the Biafrans who was actually very happy with him was his wife. She was like, and he wrote a letter that said, I fear my marriage, to his friend, Professor Jerry Bender. I fear my marriage is in jeopardy because my wife does not see what I see. Anyway, at the end, when she saw the scale of destruction, the deaths and the losses, she was like, this war has to end. And that was when she changed her tune. Now, when the war ended, there's a quote from a book by the late Chuo Kongo, who was an economic advisor to the government. He said, at war's end, there were 7 million people in the state, hungry, homeless, bereft, looking for succor. The war was over. All the rhetoric could be, what was important was to save lives. She shared with me how they would cook food for days to feed people. She didn't send people, she was there cooking. For all the brickbats that they got years later, because of people who never forgave him for being on the Nigerian side, they were cooking for days. She was leading cooperative of women, cooking and feeding people. Obviously, you're not going to feed everybody. Come on, man, 7 million people in the state. And this is just Enugu City. There were crowds coming in. But then she thought, okay, what do we do about this problem? Now, she had always been a women's activist, a women leader. She was like, let's go back to the old models where women had their own specialized role in society that was not inferior to the men. It was about having specialized, the men had their own role, the women had their own role. And all of them were crucially important to the survival and upliftment of society. So she thought about the women's cooperative, Utuolo Obodo. There was no money. You see, people think, oh, people set up an NGO so they can make money. There was no money. Depending on donations, depending on, she was like, look, organize yourself as cooperatives. The first thing, start farming. Because we have to eat. And trust me, we were hungry. I don't know, we were in Biafra, and I know what we suffered. Luckily, we came out. But I know, and we never went back to the East, but there were those who were in the East, and there's a lot that needs to be said, and I can't say it all today, but I know what they did. Women cooperatives were organized. I know my aunt, my grand aunt was involved. Getting them seedlings were provided for people to farm and start to feed themselves because the government couldn't feed everybody. The government couldn't. They just didn't have the resources. There was just too much. 7 billion people is not beans. But eventually, by 1974, 1 million women mobilized. And eventually, there was now a subvention from the state in the 1975 budget, approved in April 1975, for Utuolo Obodo to now be a formal body, like a formal a governmental department. By July 1975, there was a coup. The government of Ukpabia Seka and Gowon was overthrown. So they never had a chance to activate the government resources in any case, there's a renaissance of the state had powered through from 1970 up until 1974 when the budget was announced. But they made an impact because I've seen the statistics, I've seen the figures, I've seen the outputs because many women who I know who were involved with this could testify to the fact that Otuolo Obodo was effective. Could it have been more effective? Yes. Now she never stopped. I know what this woman suffered because after all of that, they went through a lot. Because Nigeria, when the government changes, suddenly the previous government is a devil. But they bore it all eventually, and then she became the first women leader of a national political party, the MPN, in 1979. And she eventually led NEPAD during the Obasanjo regime. She was the chairman of NEPAD. She passed away in 2015. And when she passed away, I know I was at Jazz Hall when I got the news, and I told myself, look, I'd shared several days of interviews with her, hearing her story, told without a need for self-promotion or whatever. It was just about, well, I did this. I was like, Auntie, do you know what you just said? Do you know the importance of what you've just said? She just smiled and said, okay, And that's one of why she's definitely in this book. It's not because she's my auntie or because she's my friend's mother, but because she's one of the greatest women to have ever walked under our skies. And I stand with that. Thank you.
Definitely a champion of the people and a woman who invoked this idea that women were never passive in our traditional society. Our societies were specialized. Women had their role in it, and it was not inferior. So Ed, we're going to go and speak to something rather complex, something called magic squares. So can we go to the next slide? Another legendary individual from the 18th century that definitely speaks to somebody like Lugard, who believes that we did not contribute to our societies. Can you tell us a little bit about Al-Kisnawi?
Okay, Muhammad Al-Fulani Al-Kisnawi was an 18th century mathematician and philosopher, and who, when he died, his obituary was published in Al-Jabarti, which was pretty much like an encyclopedia of the Arab world based in Egypt. He was actually based at the Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar is today a well-known, very ancient university, about 700 or 800 years old. Al-Kisnawi had gained his early training at the Gobarao Mosque in Katsina. I do not know I know Pelu has been there. Pelu, you must have gone there. I don't know if you're still around. You've been to the Gobarao Mosque. It was one of the tallest structures in West Africa, but it had to be shortened because it became dangerous to continue to maintain it. Now, mosques in Islam were not just places of worship, it was places of scholarship. Because you notice that the Al-Azhar Mosque converted to the Al-Azhar University, and it was actually a campus of the Sankore University, which was Mansa Musa's conception. We all know about Mansa Musa, the great emperor of Mali, who it wasn't just about distributing gold, it was also about encouraging scholarship. So the mosques at Jenne, Gao, and Timbuktu were high centers of knowledge, which is why today it bothers me that people that call themselves Islamic militants have been trying to destroy the ancient texts at the Gao and Timbuktu, but that's a separate issue. Now, after getting his early training, he now set off on the Hajj. And the Hajj itself was pretty much a lifelong project, because in the 18th century you were literally traveling across the desert and there was no guarantee of coming back. Lots of people actually died there happily because it was hard to travel and come back. Now he stopped at the Al-Azhar and continued the scholarship that had started in Katsina. High scholarship. I mean, Katsina produced great scholars like Dan Marina, who was also at Kano, great philosophers. And he, as a mathematician, he worked with, and because let's talk about the Arab world and mathematics. The numerals we use today are Arabic numerals. So really, it is the home of mathematics. So he had gone back to the home of mathematics, and he became a respected scholar. Eventually, if he did his graduate studies, if he did his undergraduate studies at Katsina, he did his PhD at Al-Azhar in real terms. And he became a specialist in the use of magic squares, which were calculative algorithms. And he became the first person to calculate magic squares to order 11. Now, it's pretty much close to, I'm not a mathematician, but it's pretty much close to, if you've heard of Fermat's theorem, it was pretty much akin to a feat as Fermat's theorem. He was also a philosopher, and his writings were very much, were pretty much recorded in Al-Jabati's text. I mean, there's no point printing because none of us can read Arabic here, well, a few of us can. But one of his sayings, which was encapsulated, is, "Do not give up, for that is ignorance, and not according to the rules of this art." As this art being the art of philosophy and mathematics, which were, in his own view, were inseparable. Like the lover, you cannot hope to achieve success without infinite perseverance. And he had loads of writings like that. So there you have one of the greatest mathematicians of the 18th century. Was a man that came from within the geographical sphere of Nigeria, or what became Nigeria. And so when people ask you, what did we contribute? Well, we can point to the work of Al-Kashinawi among several others scholars lost in the sands of time as one of our contributions. And it is, I'm sorry, I'm going to go off piste here and say, that's why when you hear people say Boko Haram, the books and knowledge are haram. Meanwhile, in the purest form of Islamic practice, knowledge, even in the Quran itself, knowledge is promoted. Pretty much at the beginning of the Quran, to seek knowledge. So clearly, anybody who is telling you they're Boko Haram, that is not Islam. And I'm not a Muslim, I'm a very proud Christian. But I can respect wisdom that comes from a different faith. So Boko Haram does not represent Islam, which is why, as I said, some of the modern-day militants who try to destroy the ancient texts at Timbuktu and Gao, and I'm like, why? So, sorry to go off piste, but I just needed to just drop that in.
So, what I take from this is, of course, learning about this exceptional individual that contributed to mathematics. But this idea that success without infinite perseverance doesn't happen, We all have to persevere in order to succeed. So can we go to the next slide where we're going to talk about photography and early photography in Nigeria. And three individuals, Jonathan Adagogo Green, Niels Walwenholm, and then George da Costa. Ed, can you just tell us a little bit about this idea of movement and identity, which I think photography and photographic practice really speaks to how people were moving between, say, the Gold Coast and Nigeria and Sierra Leone?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, in the before 1914, if you saw newspapers printed in Lagos, they would say Lagos, West Africa. Now, the British West Africa, as it was pretty much run as one administrative unit. Up until about the late 1880s. And in fact, the capital of British West Africa was at some point in Freetown, another point in the Gold Coast, before the various colonies now had their own capitals, Lagos and so on and so forth. And 1914, Nigeria was created. So there was a lot of mobility because the transition from the old subsistence economies before the colonials came to a salaried economy once the colonial institutions like the railways, the civil service were created, provided income. Salaried income. So people moved where the work was. And also even entrepreneurs, you're based in Gold Coast, but there's more business in Lagos. You come to Lagos and lots of settlers came, people like Niels Walwenholm, who was based in Accra, born in Accra, moved to Lagos because Lagos was a beehive of activity and of commercial activity. Even though Ghana, Tema, had a port, at the time, but Lagos was, there was business here. So there was a lot of mobility. Lots of people came from Freetown and settled in Lagos and pretty much were absorbed as Saro settlers and Lagosians that we have today. So this mobility was actually very, very, and in fact, was quite prominent. And what we see is that these three men, Adagogo Green was from the Delta. And he was quite unique from these other two in the sense that his work was pretty much centered around his immediate environment. His documentation of the Kalabari people, the Ijaw people, the Ishekiri people, the Orobo people, his documentation of, in fact, those famous photographs you see of, maybe I'm jumping the gun, but I just drop it in and then you can probably introduce that later, of Obaverame, the king of Benin, after he was exiled, were taken by him, and I will discuss that a bit more later. So the reality is that there was a lot of mobility, and what is impressive about these men is that they were pioneers at the time. The only person left out of this is H.S. Freeman, Henry Sawyer Freeman, who's also another great pioneer, who's also pretty much written out because he was known as Henry Freeman. Mm-hmm. And you lost the fact that this Sawyer was very militantly put there, so you know that he is a Nigerian. But he was written out as some of these guys were written out in the national narratives of portrayal of Africa, of Nigeria and West Africa and other parts of Africa in the late 19th century, the late 1800s and the early 1900s.
If I recall, Jonathan described himself as a photographic artist. Can you tell us what that means, this idea of photographic and artist?
Okay. For you, a photo artist or a photographic artist is someone trained in photography, not just trained to hold a camera and press capture, but actually trained in framing, composition, because then it was very intense. You would get people, you would set the way people sat, set out the lighting, and then create portraits, artistic works. It wasn't just about capturing something, saying, hey, I don't take photo, but actually creating artistic works using a camera. And you needed to be trained. And in this case, Holm was the first African to gain the membership of the Royal Photographic Society. Very rigorous qualification. He was the first African to gain this, and it was followed by Green and Da Costa much later. But you needed to be the very, very best, the best of the best. You were formally trained in the very science and art of photography, and you were beyond just the old pinhole camera, wait and get chances on the marina from the 1920s through to even to the present day. Yeah.
Yes, Ed, I believe the statistic, the date when Niles Walwyn-Holm became the first black photographer to be admitted into the Royal Photographic Society was 1897, and he was quite mobile. He was not only traveling between the Gold Coast and Nigeria, he was also traveling to the UK, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
And can you just tell us a little bit about what would it have been like to be operating as a photographer? How big was your equipment? I remember reading, I think it was Da Costa went to northern parts of Nigeria. Was it when it was for the train building, documenting train building? How arduous was that process?
Well, if you consider, because my father-in-law was a very keen photographer, and this is about 40 years after, because he started, I think it's late after the Second World War, his equipment was huge. It was a huge, several cameras, even though technology had moved on. But in the 1900s, up until, he was very active about between 1900 to 1928. You would literally have needed about 2 or 3 suitcases because the equipment itself was massive. Then it's not just about the equipment, the plates, bromide plates, the chemicals you needed, because you were literally capturing and probably even washing on site. So it was, I would say, about the equivalent of maybe a trunk box. Wow. What you needed to carry at the time. And it's quite interesting that Da Costa is very, very, very important to me on a very personal basis, because there's a photograph, our family photograph, with my grandfather, his own father, my great-grandfather, and my great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, my great-grandmother, all in one photograph, was captured in 1918 by Da Costa, because he came to my town, Obosi, and those days, it wasn't just, Da Costa didn't do it for love, it was for money. So obviously, the person who actually paid, this is another family story, the person who actually paid for the photograph to be captured was my great-great-grandmother, Keazor, a wealthy trader, and she was at the center of the photograph. She was pretty much the star, as I made a pay, so Nami go sit down for center. So everybody else was secondary to her. So yeah, he captured photographs of my village, Obosi, the chiefs, my great-grandfather with the cabinet of chiefs. So it was they were extremely important in portraying to us images of what life was like then, but let me curb my enthusiasm and let you carry on, sorry.
Well, I think your enthusiasm is really talking about this idea of what happens when we're seen by ourselves, right?
Yes,
that
yes.
power. And I'm going to just read to you a text that the artist and academic Olu Ogbe wrote in 1996 in a very important exhibition that happened at the Guggenheim called Inside African Photographers. And he was speaking specifically about Da Costa here, but he actually also mentions Niles Walwenholme in that piece. He said, rather than conjuring a society of cannibals and heathens, Da Costa's photographs of early 20th century Africa leads us to a cosmopolitanism steeped in an awareness of other cultures, a world of burgeoning elite and savvy literati, a society of international merchants, high-flying attorneys, widely traveled politicians, newspaper tycoons, and society ladies. We're still battling this idea of who gets to define who we are, who determines the African narrative. If I look around this room, I believe that what Olu was writing is very present here. But how we determine and define ourselves is still extremely contested. That is why it's really important for us to be thinking through these. Can we go to the next slide? So I just thought that we'd show you a couple of examples of Niles' photography, as well as Da Costa's, as well as as well as Green's. So this is speaking to that idea of what portraiture would have looked like, the kind of setting that would have been required, and curiously, Walwen actually he left photography, right? So. At a certain point, he decided, okay, enough with photography. I'm going to become a lawyer.
Yeah. He was actually quite unwell, so he went abroad for treatment. And whilst he was there, he decided to take the bar exams, and I think it was Lincoln's Inn, and he was admitted to the bar at Lincoln's Inn in 1911. So, but then he didn't actually stop photography. The guy came back and was like. He opened up his empire. So it was almost like my Igbo brothers, now, we're in home photography here, we're in home, law practice on the other side. So he was quite multi, but the thing is, increasingly his son took over a lot more of the photographic work between Accra and Lagos.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, if we're thinking about the history of photography, so Walwenholme was the elder of Green, who was the elder of Da Costa. So let's look at Green, quite an interesting individual whose photography circulated around the world, but it was not recognized for over a century that he was actually Nigerian. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And can we please go to the next slide?
Yes. Jonathan Adagogo Green was a Calabari son from Bonny. His father was a great Calabari trader, Sunju Dublin Green. Now, he pretty much started his career in the late 19th century, and he took, because obviously there was the means for him to be trained. He chose to enter into photography, and his father was rich enough to pay for it, because these things had to be paid for. Apart from your aptitude, there was also the financial side, and he was an exceptionally talented guy. But what is so beautiful about it is that his predisposition, or should I say his focus, preoccupation, was the Niger Delta. Some of the earliest and most powerful and edifying images of the Niger Delta were captured by J. Green, because he was capturing his people. So you would see photographs of, Urobo and a Urobo man just taking a new bride, and he would set it in such a way that, you felt this wasn't just those who look from outside, some savages with wrapper around their necks. It was like a proud man and his bride being welcomed home. He took a photograph of Mibni, the daughter of Nana of Ishakiri, taken from an elevated angle. Young girl, but the pride and self-possession in that photograph showed that he was trying to say something to the audience. Now, this photograph here was of Oba Averami. Now, I can imagine that he was in conflict, because if you know anything about Bini culture, you don't see the Oba. Before the colonials came, the Oba was only seen maybe at the end during the festivals, when he would come out, perform the dance, I think it's the Kasa dance, and then go back into his enclosure. You saw the Oba infrequently. Now, for the Oba to be captured and to be seen, In the same way that Ezenry in Igbo land was pretty much demystified by a photograph being taken. A king that you don't see. Now, this was pretty much part of my using a colloquial and a pidgin phrase, a nakeding of Oba, which was for many Benin's very unacceptable. But you can see that Adagogo Green was struggling. His masters were paying him to capture a photograph, but he also had to respect the king. So as much as you could see that struggle to maintain respect for a king, and indeed his duty to represent his principles.
Thank you, Ed. We're almost out of time, so I think that what we'll just do is we'll just look at one last individual. If you're interested about Jonathan Adagogo Green, there is a monograph that is in the exhibition space. That is a book that the late Tam Fioforo contributed to. And if you're interested in Tam's work, there's a book inside of the library where he's documenting photography of Benin culture as well. So can we go to the last slide? So one more. This is an image of Lagos taken by Da Costa, but can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, here. So Ed, let's take it back home to being a historian. I'm putting you with your family. Here we have several individuals, and of course, if you'd like to know more about them, you can go into the exhibition space. But can you just tell us about Jacob, just to continue on the story of Benin?
Yeah. Jacob Ehareva was a Benin son, and very little education, very little formal education. And in fact, I think he completed his primary education at the age of 23. But then he was obsessed with documenting the history of the Benin Kingdom. Now, if you know anything about Benin and how protective it is about its history, its culture, for it to be documented, for you to gain the confidence of the king, the Oba of Benin, and indeed of the chiefs, the great chiefs, to have them relate the history to you, it was a mark of his own credibility and incredible skills and talent, in spite of his lack of education. And eventually he wrote the very first written history of the Benin people. Right? And I say it is because I know there were certain histories written by anthropologists and the like earlier on, which, as far as I'm concerned, do not represent what the history. Those were not histories of the Benin people. This was the history of the Benin people sanctioned by the Oba himself, even though it was after the invasion and so on and so forth. And he was so important to the kingdom that he was actually the curator of the Benin Museum, which was commissioned by the Oba himself. So Ehareva is truly, there are people look, every historical work is subject to peer review and criticism. There are many people who say it does not represent the actual, that it represents more of the Western side of it. But say, well, it was sanctioned by the Oba, and no one can really question the grand volume, should I say, the preponderance of the data that he collected. It was a monumental effort from a man with very limited formal education. So it's something I always say, history is too important to be left only to the historians. And there's nothing what they can tell me that Ehareva was not, by his output, one of the finest historians of his time, at least from the Benin perspective.
And did it lead to opening the door for him to become the curator of the museum there?
Absolutely, because the thing is that he showed gravitas and understanding, and he was also now the bridge between antiquity, which is what Benin traditions were, and modernity. And the modernity is in the creation of museums. Now let's get something about Benin art. Benin art, all the bronzes you saw and all those sculptures were not for public consumption. They were not for public display. They were specifically created as the property of the Oba to be kept in his palace. So that when you saw, during the invasion, all those horrible photographs of the pillaging and people posing, the invaders posing with those things, well, the huge desecration. So that in a way, for the Oba to say, okay, we shall place some of these treasures here, was a concession, but a concession on the Oba's own terms. And let me tell you just a little example about how Benin's Edos don't joke with the palace. They don't joke with their culture. I was working for Google in a project for Google in 2013, and I went to get geodata of the palace. My guide, a Benin taxi driver, took me there. Unfortunately, the secretary wasn't around, so we couldn't get permission. As we were leaving, I was like, make I just capture one photograph from my camera of the gate. My guide went absolutely militant. He was like, no try am. No try am. They know to take photograph of our place. So this guy who had been very respectful and oga, full circle. And I was filled with pride. I was like, my brother, God bless you. That's what we're supposed to do, not be joke. You understand? So that is how the Benin take their history. So for him to have gotten the seal of approval to create these was a massive, massive accolade to his abilities and credibility.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much for your hard work, for your enthusiasm. This is a project that took 5 years for him to do the research, traveling more than 5,000 miles around Nigeria. He's about to release a new book. The first one had 120 unsung figures, and this new one is
130 new ones. So we're not.
130.
Yeah.
You know, so there's a lot of people out there that we should be looking out for. So just to wrap it up before we go to questions, the goal has been to, by revisiting their journeys and struggles, we gain a deeper understanding of promised lands, not just as a physical destination, but as a powerful metaphor for the pursuit of progress, justice, and finding our way. So Ed, if you feel bad about it, what do you do?
Do something about it.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank
That's
you
how we
so
roll.
much, Ed. So now we're going to hear you guys and your questions. So can you please pass them on to us? Oh gosh, this is a curious one. Why should we buy art as an investment? Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, actually, investments are not just about the financial returns you get from it. They're actually emotional returns, that you get from a piece of art. So it depends on what, that the intrinsic value to you is only something that you can dictate. So why should we buy? Because it enhances us, it uplifts us emotionally, and also if you can make more money, why not? That's all I can say. I don't quite know how otherwise to answer that question.
Okay. So we have another question here. This is actually, it's how do we access all of the information you've just shared on this stage? Is it available online?
Wow. No. Sadly, I wrote this book 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and it was published 10 years ago. And Moki is not here. It was actually published by Moki Makura, her company. And it was a commission by First Bank. The concept of the Great Nigerians You Never Knew had actually been conceived in 2013 as Social Media Week, because Obi had said, bro, which lecture are you going to deliver? I was like, I don't know. I think I probably had a couple of Guinnesses. I was like, this is what I want to do, because I want to show things, something that's off the beaten track. There's no point doing what people have done before. Yeah, great Nigerians, but those who you didn't know. And I did it, I think it was 30 great Nigerians, and eventually it was expanded. So it's not readily available anywhere. But the thing is, I'm really hoping that the 130 great Nigerians would actually be available in digital format, because the sheer size of those books does not lend itself to just printing and hoping that people will buy it. You understand? It's about 400-500 pages, right? So the pure basic economics means that unless a publisher is willing to invest that money on, in the hope that people will spend maybe the equivalent of about 40,000 naira to buy one, so it will be available in digital format from March next year, the new edition. So that's then when the people that can actually get their hands on it.
I believe we have a few more questions. I think of you as a romantic. You're also a historian. Is there a link? Are there links?
That's a good question. Well, you have to have the inspiration you actually have to love the art of history. But then history is a science. And you see, for me, transition to history was not hard because I was a litigation lawyer, and I still am. Okay? You deal with evidence. Romance, there has no place. Probably in the telling of it, you can use small romance to make it easier for people to digest. You see, but it is a science, and it's a very strict science, because you can't go there and just anything enter your head, you put them for paper. No, you actually have to gather the data, analyze the data, collate, publish, peer review, publish. Okay? It is a very, very formal thing. But am I romantic? Oh, yes. Because the concept of this was romantic, thinking, look, we can be better than all this now. We can be better than all this, all the way that people have made us feel as if we are not. No, we are not. We can be, and that you have to have a certain romantic side, idealistic side, a certain love of yourself. And self is not just an individual, but yourself. To say, look, you know what, come. In spite of our differences, we have a lot in common. In spite of our differences, we have a lot, and part of our difficulties, we have a lot to be proud of. And look, man, the days we're in now, it takes something to feel that. That's why I think the churches and the mosques are very important. Because the logic says, oh God, there's no hope. But then religion, faith, and romance says there's hope. Faith says there's hope, even though there's difficulty. So look, we need our romance, we need them. Thank you, my sister.
Ed, what can we do to pass this history to the younger generation? Not just old history, but modern day history as well.
Well, the reality is that my talk at Social Media Week is about how social media has demystified and democratized history, access to history. Because the reality is at the time, to gain access to history, you needed to read books. And historians wrote in ways that may not have been accessible. Now, you can access knowledge on Twitter. You can access knowledge on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, on all these, even on TikTok, so that is a way. People have been telling me, why don't you do a podcast for like about 10 years, well, not 10 years recently, but why don't you do a program or do some other stuff years ago? And I never really got round to it. But the reality is that I've begun to feel the need to get this information out there, but there are lots of other people doing it, probably even better than myself. So the key is that I have a bit of knowledge, but there's lots that all of you here know that I don't know. So I'll say again, history is too important to be left to the historians alone. All of us here are historians. My aburo there, Victor, is an historian because he captures images. He may not be writing big grammar there, but those images themselves are records of our history. By the Evidence Act, a photograph is a document. This is history because these men gathered history. The photographers gathered history. So we are all historians. We all have a responsibility. My father is a nonagenarian. I constantly disturb him. I get information out of him constantly. We all have people around us of a certain vintage who can gather history. My sister-in-law here, she can remember everything. Anything in family history, nothing that even when myself and my wife, we want to find out something. So let's ask Sister Tyra. She'll know. Family historians are all around us. All around us. So we all have a responsibility, and I charge you, please, call to action. I bet men go and gather those histories and publish them. It's absolutely important. There's nothing I've done that that every single one of us here could not do if we had the time and the interest. And that's my point.
Do you think the lack of connection to our history in our generation can impact the future of Africa?
Without question. Without question. At the talk I delivered recently, I said, look, the nature of the early histories of Nigeria by the colonial authorities were not geared towards education or uplifting our knowledge. It was pretty much feasibility study for the extraction project. Finish. And I'm sorry, I don't see why anybody should say anything wrong with it. They stated their intention. So what does it then mean for us? It's like, okay, now that they finished their own, the intention is for us to now create our own history. And the Ibadan school, the Pan-Africanist school after independence, were at the forefront of creating an indigenous history written by historians, people like Kenneth Dike, Saboru Biabaku, and the like, where at the Ibadan school, who actually began to tell history from the perspective of Africans. And it was important to counter the narratives. As I said, we saw Lugard's statement. I don't want to, because what Lugard does to me.
Yes.
But the reality is that it is not your responsibility is not to respond to Lugard, but to create a body of history that makes Lugard's comments unimportant. Toni Morrison was like, look, we can't be twisting and squirming to every gaslighting that the right-wing eugenicist commentators. We can't. No. What we should do is still create our own narratives for ourselves. I work a lot with children, with school children. I work a lot with schools whenever the opportunity arises, and I'm actually hoping, and this is actually a call to Artex, that after this, I would love the opportunity, I won't charge you, free of charge, to talk to schools, to talk to young people, because they are the ones that are important. They need to learn these histories because they will pass it on to their own children. And you create that critical mass of information. And I'm just going to quote to end, Eko Eshun, the Anglo-Ghanaian journalist. When they asked him, why are you always going on about the rights of Africans, the rights of black people, and the history of Africa? He says, well, we have to create a wall of noise that deafens the noise made by the Enoch Powells of this world. Now, if you know Enoch Powell, he's a right-wing politician. We have to make noise that drowns them out. And, the reality is that until the hunter will continue to tell the story, until, the children of the forest learn to create their own narrative. And it is the responsibility of every single one of us, it's not just me, because all of us here learn from each other. So it is a collective responsibility, absolutely crucial.
I think for me, one of the things is that through this project with you and also other projects here around interdisciplinary research, really what we're trying to show is what becomes available to us when we seek. Each of us has to seek. Each of us has to persevere. Each of us has to find our life path. If you're interested in looking a little bit more at interdisciplinary research, please go to the library. And on the last note, I would like to say thank you to all of the people that contributed to this project, including Fikayo, who was on the curatorial team. Hailey over here did an amazing job on the production side, as well as Farhan, who without her, none of this would be possible. And Emmanuel, a lovely graphic designer, Nigerian graphic designer that's based in Montreal. So thank you very much.
Thank you.